Concordia, Kansas, 1943. The barbed wire fences of Camp Concordia stretched endlessly under the vast, indifferent sky, a stark geometric scar on the boundless American prairie. Inside, thousands of German prisoners of war braced themselves for a fate they'd been told to expect: harsh labor, resentment, and the bitter taste of defeat. But out here, in the heartland, something was brewing that would defy every expectation of wartime animosity. In the very nation they were taught to despise, these enemy soldiers were not met with scorn or suspicion, but with an offer of work, and eventually, a surprising degree of humanity that would forever change their understanding of themselves and the so-called enemy. Before we delve into this extraordinary chapter of World War II, take a moment. Where in the world are you watching from right now? And what does the word enemy truly mean to you? Klaus Richter, a young, earnest Wehrmacht corporal, huddled amongst his comrades in the stifling hold of the troop transport. He had been captured during the grinding battles in North Africa, a conflict that had already begun to chip away at the edges of his youthful idealism. Hailing from a small agricultural town nestled in the verdant valleys of Bavaria, Klaus was fiercely proud of his heritage and his Führer's vision, yet a quiet weariness had settled deep in his bones, a residue of the endless, brutal desert campaigns. He had absorbed every word of the propaganda that painted the Americans as soft, decadent, and materialistic, a nation incapable of truly understanding the rigors of sustained, righteous conflict. He fully anticipated a grim reception on American soil, cruelty, perhaps starvation, or at best a relentless campaign of humiliation designed to break the spirit of the vanquished. He expected a chaotic, inefficient system, a stark contrast to the perceived order and discipline of the German war machine. Even the smell of the ship's cramped quarters, thick with sweat and stale fear, hinted at an uncertain, unpleasant future. He tried to summon defiance, to remember the tales of German strength, but the unfamiliar rumble of the American trains beneath him, the constant, unsettling movement across a vast, unknown continent, chipped away at his resolve. As they crossed the endless plains, an alien smell of dry earth and unfamiliar crops began to permeate the air, occasionally punctuated by the distant, almost jarring sound of farm machinery, a world away from the familiar thunder of artillery that had defined his recent existence. The bland, unfamiliar rations they received were, to his surprise, consistent and relatively filling, a small, inconvenient detail that already began to poke holes in his preconceived notions of American vindictiveness. The arrival at Camp Concordia was a scene etched in his memory. The initial processing was harsh and impersonal, a blur of barking orders, uniform confiscations, and sterile interrogations that momentarily confirmed his worst fears. But then came the unexpected announcement, delivered by Major Thompson, the camp commander. He was a man whose square jaw and piercing gaze conveyed authority, yet lacked the overt cruelty Klaus had braced for. Standing beside the major was a disparate group of local farmers, their faces etched with the lines of hard labor and sun, their eyes a mix of apprehension and quiet determination. Major Thompson's voice, devoid of triumph or malice, cut through the tension. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice resonating across the assembly, "due to severe wartime labor shortages, this nation faces a critical challenge: feeding its people and its fighting forces. You are here as prisoners of war, but you are also able-bodied men. You will be contracted out to work on local farms, to help bring in the harvest. Your labor will be vital." A wave of disbelief, thick and palpable, swept through the ranks of the prisoners. Klaus felt his stomach clench. Was this some new form of psychological warfare, a subtle degradation? He exchanged bewildered glances with his friend Hans. "They want us to work for them? Like common laborers?" Hans merely shook his head, his face a mask of confusion. Klaus searched the faces of the farmers, expecting to find triumphant sneers or thinly veiled hatred, but saw only a pragmatic blend of concern and stoicism. They weren't gloating. They were nodding solemnly, as if this arrangement, while unusual, was simply another hardship to be met. Camp Concordia, designed for 4,000 prisoners, was a hub for this extraordinary program. On that specific day, a contingent of 250 newly arrived German POWs, including Klaus, was told they would be helping to save thousands of acres of vital food crops, an economic output estimated to be worth millions of dollars annually for the war effort. The Concordia Blade Empire reported on July 15, 1943. Local farmers facing critical labor shortages due to conscription today welcomed the first contingents of German POWs assigned to agricultural work details. As farmer Elmer Johnson stated, "It ain't ideal, but we got crops to get in and these hands are gonna do it." Simple as that. The stark practicality of it all was, in its own way, the first shock. The Kansas sun was an unforgiving master, beating down with a relentless intensity Klaus had only previously encountered in the North African desert. But here, the dry heat offered no shade, only endless rows of corn stalks stretching to the horizon. The work was brutal, a relentless cycle of planting, tending, and harvesting. His muscles ached in ways he hadn't known possible, his hands calloused and raw. Each working detail, typically 15-20 men, was expected to harvest an average of 15-20 acres of specific crops per week, a pace only achievable through sustained effort. The efficiency of the POW labor was a constant topic in local agricultural reports, with output often exceeding expectations. Yet despite the demanding labor, the Miller family, a stoic, weathered couple who owned the farm where Klaus was assigned, provided proper tools, regular water breaks, and to Klaus's bewildered surprise, the very same basic meals they ate themselves: hearty stews, fresh bread, and sometimes even a slice of apple pie. There was no overt cruelty, no taunts, just the tough, honest grind of farm work. An entry from Major Thompson's daily log underscored the initial pragmatism. Day 3 of farm details. Minor grumbling, but work continues. Farmer Miller reports satisfactory progress and no trouble, requesting additional water rations for field teams due to heat. Klaus was physically exhausted at the end of each day, his body screaming for rest, but his mind buzzed with confusion. The Millers were firm, their instructions clear and concise, but they were also fair. Mr. Miller, a man of few words, would occasionally offer a gruff, clipped instruction or a terse nod of approval for a job well done. Klaus watched their own tireless work ethic, the way they moved with a practiced rhythm through the fields, their dedication to the land undeniable. The ingrained notion of American softness began to crack, slowly, subtly, under the relentless Kansas sun. He began to see practicality, the simple imperative of getting the harvest in, overriding ideology. As the weeks blurred into months, a quiet rhythm settled over the fields. The initial language barrier, though still present, began to yield to the necessities of shared labor. Mr. Miller would point to a tool, say its English name, and Klaus would repeat it, sometimes fumbling, sometimes getting it right. Slowly, haltingly, they learned snippets of each other's tongues. There were shared laughs over a dropped hoe or a comical misunderstanding of an instruction. Mrs. Miller, a kind-faced woman with flour perpetually clinging to her apron, would occasionally bring out extra lemonade on exceptionally hot afternoons, or even a small, home-baked pie. These weren't just for her family, but for the German boys, as she'd call them, her tone devoid of malice. Over 300 distinct farms and local businesses eventually contracted POW labor from Camp Concordia, creating a complex web of interactions across the region. This economic integration was unprecedented, providing over 1 million man-days of labor throughout the war. Klaus found himself, almost unconsciously, sharing anecdotes about his family's farm in Bavaria with Mr. Miller, finding common ground in their shared agricultural roots, the universal language of soil and seasons. He felt a growing, unsettling sense of connection to these enemies. He started to question the dehumanization he was taught, seeing individuals with families, worries, and a fierce love for their land. A heavily censored letter home from Klaus to his mother, written during this period, revealed his internal struggle. "The work is hard, but the land is rich. The Americans, they are strange. They speak little of the war, mostly of corn and rain." The words were careful, guarded, omitting the burgeoning sense of camaraderie. He knew his mother would not understand, could not possibly fathom the unexpected humanity he encountered. He did, however, occasionally encounter veiled hostility from some townsfolk when they visited town for supplies under guard, sharp, suspicious glances that reminded him of his true status as an enemy, preventing him from forgetting entirely the larger conflict. The uneasy peace of the arrangement was periodically threatened by external scrutiny. One particularly tense week saw the arrival of a visiting military dignitary, accompanied by a journalist from a national newspaper, both keen to scrutinize the lenient treatment of POWs. Their probing questions created a temporary chill, making the farmers more cautious, their interactions with the prisoners becoming visibly more formal. Klaus and his comrades felt the shift, a tightening of the leash, reminding them of the fragility of their strange existence. Yet Klaus observed the subtle defiance of the millers, who, despite the watchful eyes, maintained their respectful tone and fair treatment. The dignity of the POW's labor was, for them, non-negotiable. Despite the close proximity and often informal interactions, escape attempts from Camp Concordia were remarkably low, statistically less than 0.5%, and those who did attempt to flee were often quickly apprehended, some even returning voluntarily, highlighting a surprising sense of compliance and even comfort within the program. An editorial in a regional newspaper, published around this time, captured the undercurrent of unease. While the need for labor is undeniable, one must ask if the comforts afforded to enemy prisoners in Kansas are truly in line with the sacrifices our boys are making overseas. Vigilance remains paramount. Klaus, overhearing snippets of conversation, felt a strange surge of defensiveness toward the millers, a fierce, unexpected loyalty. He started actively reflecting on the propaganda he had consumed for years, realizing how starkly it contrasted with the lived reality of his daily life. He was caught in a deep internal conflict. His ingrained loyalty to his homeland clashed violently with the undeniable human connection he was experiencing. Every shared meal, every common task, every quiet nod of understanding chipped away at the edifice of his indoctrination. Then, disaster struck, swift and brutal. A severe, unseasonal hailstorm ripped through the Kansas plains, lashing the fields with ice, tearing apart the ripening wheat, the Miller family's primary livelihood, in a matter of minutes. Klaus, caught in the open, watched in horror as the sky turned an apocalyptic green, and shards of ice shredded months of arduous labor. Mr. Miller, attempting desperately to cover a critical section of his remaining crop, was caught in the worst of it, emerging bloodied and limping, his face a mask of defeat. The visible distress of Mrs. Miller and their children, witnessing their year's efforts crumble before their eyes, was palpable. They faced ruin. Without a word, without any order from the guards or camp command, Klaus felt an instinct take over. He saw not an enemy, but a man, a family in desperate need. He saw the shared land they had toiled on. He called out to Hans and the others in their detail, a quiet, urgent plea in German, and then, in broken English, to the guards. The usual formalities evaporated. With a spontaneous, silent agreement, Klaus and his fellow POWs organized. They worked with a furious, desperate energy, ignoring the lingering pain from the storm, pushing past their own physical limits. They salvaged what little they could, using ingenuity and the farming knowledge that was deeply ingrained in them, even if it was from different soil. Klaus, drawing upon his Bavarian farm wisdom, directed them, showing them how to prop up damaged stalks, how to meticulously gather even the bruised grains. This act of genuine, selfless aid, motivated by a shared human crisis rather than military command, profoundly shifted the relationship between them. It was a moment where enemy and ally dissolved, replaced by something far more fundamental. Neighbor. The hailstorm, a destructive force, ironically became the catalyst for a profound human connection, stripping away the last vestiges of ideology. The strange, symbiotic relationship between the German POWs and the American farmers was, at its heart, an intricate dance choreographed by the Geneva Convention and the pragmatic realities of war. The U.S. Army's adherence to the Geneva Convention, particularly regarding Article 31 on prisoner labor, became a surprisingly liberal framework. POWs, like Klaus, were paid a nominal 80 cents a day for their toil, much of which was used at the camp commissary to purchase tobacco, toiletries, or extra sweets. This payment system, outlined in Army Service Forces Circular No. 98, allowed a transactional dignity that fostered cooperation, sharply contrasting with the forced, unpaid labor imposed on Allied prisoners in Axis countries. The framework also stipulated that POW labor could not directly aid the war effort against their own country, which meant no munitions factories, but vast agricultural fields were fair game, a nuance that allowed for this extraordinary experiment. For Klaus and his fellow prisoners, the psychological stakes were immense. They grappled with a profound cognitive dissonance, working for and in many cases forming bonds with the very enemy their propaganda had demonized. The consistent decency they encountered, the shared meals, the simple acts of human kindness, slowly but relentlessly eroded the edifice of Nazi ideology they had been fed. There was an internal guilt, a confusion about their changing loyalties. How could men who were supposed to be soft and weak be so resilient, so kind? How could their own leaders have lied so profoundly? The longing for their homes in a war-torn Germany was constant, yet it was now strangely mixed with an unexpected sense of belonging in the endless fields of Kansas. Klaus struggled to reconcile the reality of the Miller farm with the monstrous caricatures of Americans he had believed. He began to filter his letters home, meticulously censoring any mention of the kindness he received, fearing misunderstanding, or worse, accusations of disloyalty from a family still steeped in the propaganda he was now unlearning. For the Millers and their neighbors, the psychological tightrope walk was equally complex. The constant tension between their patriotic duty to see these men as the enemy and the pragmatic necessity of utilizing their labor slowly but inexorably evolved into genuine human connection. It was a challenge to overcome ingrained prejudice, to see past the uniform and recognize the individual humanity within. Mrs. Miller, initially hesitant, found herself making an extra pie for the boys, a simple act that spoke volumes. The complex emotions that arose from this dynamic were often unspoken, but deeply felt. They were saying goodbye to men who were once foes, but who had, against all odds, become essential, if temporary, parts of their community. Dr. Evelyn Reed, a historian specializing in wartime sociology, noted that the shared daily rhythm of farm work, the common struggle against the elements, stripped away the uniform and revealed the man beneath. It was a powerful, if temporary, antidote to wartime propaganda, forging bonds that many, American and German alike, found unsettling yet profoundly human. Her research, spanning dozens of interviews with former farmers, documented a consistent pattern of initial mistrust evolving into mutual respect, a testament to the power of shared experience. Then came the news. VE Day. Victory in Europe. The war on the Western Front was over. A torrent of conflicting emotions swept through Camp Concordia. Relief, immense and profound for the war's end. A deep, unsettling sorrow for Germany's defeat, for the homeland he would return to, ravaged and broken. And for Klaus, a profound sadness about leaving Kansas. The order came for repatriation and the preparations began. This was the true battle, not of bullets and bombs, but of farewells. Klaus, amidst the bustling preparations, clutched a small, carefully carved wooden bird, a gift from Hans, his friend, a memento of their shared captivity. Tucked secretly into his uniform pocket was a faded photograph, a distant shot of the Miller farm, taken surreptitiously one afternoon. He sought out Mr. Miller, finding him by the old tractor. There were no grand pronouncements, no emotional speeches, just a long, quiet handshake, farmer to farmer. Mr. Miller's grip was firm. His eyes, usually so guarded, now held a deep, unspoken respect, a shared acknowledgement of the extraordinary chapter they had lived through. Klaus looked back at the endless fields, the vast expanse of Kansas prairie that had been his unexpected home for so long, and knew he was leaving a piece of himself there. He grappled with the uncertainty of his future in a destroyed Germany, knowing that the experiences of Camp Concordia would forever shape him, a quiet revolutionary planted deep in his soul. Mr. Miller stood with Mrs. Miller and their children by the roadside, watching the long convoy of trucks rumble away, carrying the German prisoners towards their distant ships. He felt a strange ache, a void that would be hard to fill, both in terms of the crucial labor they had provided and the unique camaraderie that had, against all odds, blossomed. He remembered Klaus's quiet diligence, his surprising leadership during the hailstorm, the shared jokes in broken English. He realized that somewhere along the way, he had stopped seeing them as Nazis, as the enemy, and simply saw them as men, as workers, and yes, even as temporary friends. The quiet returns to the farm, the fields stretching empty under the vast sky. But something had shifted within him, within his family. He felt a sense of hope for the future, a quiet understanding that such connections were possible even in the crucible of war, even across the deepest divides. The Concordia Blade Empire published a final piece on the POW's departure, reflecting on the unprecedented experiment that redefined enemy relations in their small town. Major Thompson, in a private memo, recorded the success of the program in maintaining morale and contributing significantly to the war economy, a quiet triumph amidst the larger conflict. The fields of Concordia, once bustling with German labor, returned to the quiet hum of American hands. The immediate void was palpable, not just in the absence of manpower, but in the subtle shift in the community's rhythm. American soldiers returned home, needing jobs, finding their lives forever altered by overseas conflict, while Concordia adapted, the quiet returning, yet forever marked by the foreign presence. The farmers felt the loss of both crucial labor and the unique camaraderie that had formed. Klaus returned to a Germany devastated, its cities bombed, its people broken and disillusioned. He found it difficult to articulate his Kansas experiences, the sheer, bewildering humanity he had encountered, to a populace that either endured immense suffering or clung fiercely to nationalist pride. How could he explain the kindness of Mrs. Miller, the quiet respect of Mr. Miller, the shared laughter in the fields, when his countrymen had known only hardship and destruction? He quietly rebuilt his life, often drawing on the resilience and practical ingenuity he had witnessed in Kansas, applying the lessons learned from American farmers to his own war-torn land. Some POWs, like Klaus, maintained secret correspondence with American families for years, letters carefully written and even more carefully hidden, tiny threads connecting two worlds that were officially still divided. The experience instilled in many a lifelong questioning of dogma and a deeper, more profound appreciation for individual humanity, a quiet revolution in their souls. Decades later, in the late 1990s, a German historian, Dr. Anna Schmidt, a grandchild of a former Camp Concordia POW, arrived in Concordia, Kansas. She was on a pilgrimage, searching for remnants of Camp Concordia and the farms that had hosted her grandfather's generation. She discovered old newspaper clippings in dusty archives, faded photographs in local historical societies, and listened to the poignant stories of elderly Kansans who still, vividly, remembered the German boys who had worked their fields. This visit sparked renewed interest in the program, leading to a small museum dedicated to Camp Concordia, with a humble historical marker at the former campsite, its quiet presence a testament to a forgotten chapter of history. And perhaps the most powerful legacy, a reunion between descendants, American and German, bridging generations and revealing the enduring human connections forged across enemy lines, a testament to the astonishing truth that even in humanity's darkest hours, kindness, shared labor, and simple human connection can bridge the deepest divides. What does this extraordinary chapter of history truly tell us about the nature of the enemy and the profound, often unexpected ways in which empathy can bloom amidst conflict? Hit that subscribe button if you want more untold stories from World War II that will make you question everything you thought you knew about history, and perhaps about the boundless capacity of the human spirit.